Last time we created quite a few problems from looking at portions of the Quran, passages in the Quran that are not clear or at best contain some truth, but not all. And so this time we're going to have some Christian response, some answers actually in lecture 18, unit number 5, and try to bring some answers with empathy, with understanding, and with wisdom. It's Christian response to the Quranic denials. And I think the first thing that we need to say, or we need to do, is we empathize with Muslims. What do we empathize with? We empathize with their struggle. And we really want to help them understand that God was vindicated after his death, not before his death, by the resurrection. That is what John says, when I will be raised up, I will draw all people to me. And so I guess we do agree with Muslims, and we struggle with them in this. But we know that it's just a matter of time. And this is how God decides to do it. And we must let God be God. The time for Jesus' vindication was afterwards. His purpose was not to let Jesus die for anything else. And it's a question, too, for Christians. I don't think that Christians always get this. The victory in Easter. We celebrate Christmas with great gusto. But do we really understand the importance of Easter, that this is really the victory of God? Now, another thing is that the gospel accounts are historical, whereas the Quran is polemical. And I think, just as a bit of an aside, when we resort, so totally to polemics, we're really responding in kind. In other words, we have, I think, greater resources than polemics. We have greater resources at our disposal. And we must give more credit to historical accounts than to polemical accounts. In reference to the Quran, there's only one text, and without eyewitnesses, but thinking of the Gospels, there are 4 accounts, and with many eyewitnesses. And Jesus kept saying to his disciples, this is the way I'm going. I am on my way to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be crucified, but he will rise again. This is the way that I must go, and that's what the Gospel records give. Now, the denial is unorthodox. And when you think of denials, the Ahmadiyya come to mind. These are I used to think of them almost as like the Jehovah's Witnesses of Islam, because they were so argumentative. In my experience, they were the ones who came up with all of the arguments, and other Muslims often pick up these. For example, Ahmadiyyat, the late Ahmadiyyat, seemed to use their material. Now, the Ahmadiyyas in Pakistan, I don't know how much, what percentage it is, but probably only about 4 million of them. They have suffered a great deal, more than Christians, because they are a heretical sect. They were declared in 1974 to be non-Muslims. The sect was founded by Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who died in 1908. Another thing is that the disciples were cowardly. They fled, so that, in other words, this whole event puts them in bad light. They would rather have resolved it, or rather avoided it. You see, the Bible does not conceal, does not hide the sins and the weaknesses of God's people. Look at the sin of David. Although it was written by the Jews, and the Gospels record the cowardice of disciples, though it was written by them. And this is proof of their authenticity. It would have been easier to say that Jesus was not put to death and that they did not flee. You see the reasoning? And the truth is that the disciples were eventually convinced. Remember how surprised they were. They expected that, God would raise him up or save him like he had done for Enoch and Elijah. And there is no precedence for the resurrection. So from the human point of view, the disciples would much more easily have been able to accept that Jesus was taken up into heaven, as God took Enoch and Elijah. And they were reluctant to accept Jesus' death. Why? Why did they believe? Because really they had no choice. They were forced to believe. And when we work with Muslims, we must read the Bible about the resurrection of Jesus, because Muslims really do not know the facts, and the facts are powerful. We must think like Muslims. We must get behind them and look through their eyes. Another thing is that God is not deceitful. Some Muslims seem to be hesitant or embarrassed by the substitution theory. God is deceitful if he works this out. So they would say, let us leave it to God. And so they would say, we are sure that Jesus did not die. That's all we can say. And it's a vague, a difficult, well, you can almost say a ridiculous theory. And many Muslims are embarrassed by it. And let's also remember that Jesus could have been rescued. He says that this is what I'm going to do. This is what I've got to do. And so the challenge with Muslims is to understand the meaning behind the event, so that they can understand the fact of it, understand the faithfulness of God, and submit their wills and their minds to it. Also, God is trustworthy. You see, our attitude towards suffering is our attitude towards God, even to his death. We must trust God. We must have faith in God. And the Sunnis really are lacking in this theology. Why? Because they've always been the majority. They've had the upper hand. They rejected Ali, and as we have seen, they opposed by Muawiyah, and then Yazid killed Hussein. So the Shiites have learned to suffer. The Sunnis have suffered too in many ways because of the difficulties that Muslims have. And they do have, I suppose, in a limited sense, some kind of redemptive suffering, because they say that those who die in jihad will have a reward. So that is something, the acceptance of suffering. But we go on to look at the fact that God will be vindicated. Yes, God allowed many prophets to die, and you can see that in the Bible, but there are also signs of it in the Quran. And he will vindicate them on Resurrection Day. He doesn't vindicate his people immediately. God's people can suffer. And I think even Christians, some Christians are really lacking in an understanding of this. The Sunnis in particular, I believe, have missed this. But Shiites have a better understanding because of what happened at Karbala, when Hussein was brutally and unmercifully killed. Further, Christian response is, let's think of the bridge building. You see that bridge there? This is really what we're trying to do with bridges. We want them to understand, Muslims to understand the things that we're talking about, and the best thing we can do is try to build bridges. We are thinking about his divinity, and we must emphasize that it is not a physical thing. When Jesus is spoken of, when God is spoken of as the eternal Father in Isaiah 9, We must ask Muslims why he was given that term. Now, in the version that I have, it's the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace, and so on. But there it is in Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 6. But perhaps Muslims will listen to it more carefully and give it more regard if we look at the words of Jesus, because they accept his more than, and they don't really know much about Isaiah at all. You see, his own claims. What about his claims? Well, he said that he would be the judge in the last days, and he said, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. He forgives people from their sins, and many other things in the gospel with no prophet before him has ever done, including and especially the forgiveness of sins. His teaching was very clear. The listeners, his audience, caught on and they objected. So his own claims are even more explicit than what you have in the Old Testament. Did Muhammad ever forgive sins? Did he ever say, I am the truth? Did he ever say that I will be with you forever? Did Muhammad claim to be the judge on the last day? Did he say ever, he who has seen me has seen the Father? Did Muhammad, if Muhammad did say that, would you believe that he is more than a prophet? We need to ask our Muslim friends. So the question keeps coming back to us, almost a haunting question when you work with Muslims. Why did Jesus not say clearly, I am God? And I think the reason he didn't is because he was working with people who were fanatically monotheistic, and they were not prepared to deal directly with this. So he went around, and in various and sundry means, he proved to them as a good teacher. He didn't want to impose himself off on them and, cut off all avenues of communication. They would have rejected him, of course. And so he does it in various ways. Even on trial, Jesus did not seem to speak directly to the straight questions, but they still understood him, and they condemned him. So I think that's the reason. Now, the 99 names of God, each name tells you something about Allah. And when you look at the Bible, all of those claims, every name that, in other words, every name that is given to Allah coincides with something that Jesus has is also worthy of. I have a chart that compares all of those names with how Christ has fulfilled every one of them. One who forgives, one who saves, one who protects. And then, for example, Muhammad never did say that he had knowledge of the unseen. In fact, he said, I do not have knowledge of the unseen in 11 and 31. Or 11 and 123. But Jesus did say that he had this knowledge. Now, regarding his sonship, we need to explain that this is metaphorical. We are not talking about the literal sense here as God's people, because, the Bible talks a lot about this. It says we are God's children. The Bible says Adam was the son of God in genealogy of Jesus in Luke chapter 3. The angels are the sons of God in John 1. Israel were the sons of God, Solomon in 2 Samuel 7. And Jesus' disciples talk to our Father. So Jesus is not exclusively the Son of God, although he is unique. And we will, of course, talk about all of those things. He is unique. But it's noted that Jesus did submit to God. He did submit to God. Al-Faruqi, whom we've talked about before, said this. He says, assuming all men necessarily to be fallen, to stand in predicament of the original sin of alienation from God, of self-contradiction or falling short of God, the Islamic Khalifa claims him to be the ruler, has all that is necessary to do, all God requires. And listen to this, salvation is not in the vocabulary of Islam. Man just needs guidance and must try to live in obedience to it. Islam means submit to it. There is no need of redemption in Islam. End of quote. Now, according to the the Gospels actually, Jesus was the only human being. He was a human being. He submitted to God. He submitted to his limitations. And at one point he said, he said the Father is greater than he is. John 14 and verse 28. He was afraid of death. And but he did submit to God. And Jesus is unique. Let us explain his uniqueness. It is true that Jesus not only was born in a supernatural way, yet he was unique because all other prophets were born no other prophet was born in an extraordinary way. All had mother and father, and Jesus did not have a father. Now, Jesus' signs. As for Jesus' miracles in the gospel, miracles are signs. He fed the crowd, and he said, I'm the bread of life. He healed the blind, and he said, I'm the light of the world. In the Quran, it says in a verse which is called ayah, or in Urdu it's ayat, the Quran asks people to wonder about God's signs. But the miracles of Jesus are more than a record. And so one way to talk about Jesus might be to talk about the signs and what they mean. Jesus is the Messiah. For example, what does it mean that it says Jesus is the Messiah? The Quran calls him the Messiah, but it doesn't really explain it, what it means. And we know from the Bible that he is the anointed one. And this is the one, this term is loaded with meaning. The anointed one who's coming. The promised one, the Redeemer, who will restore and redeem. So we might be able to build on that in Surah 19 and verse 21. He is the prophet. He is a prophet. And Jesus is a prophet according to the Quran. But what does that mean? And what of his teaching? Well, you get that from the significance of his teaching from the Sermon on the Mount. What did he say about the law, etc.? So one way to work with Muslims is to build bridges by finding out what they already know and going from there, miracles, prophethood, etc. Now, regarding his atoning death, the law, how does the Bible proceed to convince us about our sin? Well, it does it through the law because that's, the Bible says, is our schoolmaster. How can Muslims believe so much in the law and yet miss the point for their own terrible sin and their inability to deliver themselves? Remember the fellow in the New Testament who comes to Jesus and he says, I've done all these. I've done I've kept the law. Well, Jesus doesn't challenge him. He loves him for having tried to obey the law in Mark 10, 17 through 27. But the guy was not saved. He was not redeemed. How can you obey the law and not be saved? And the Jews that Jesus worked with, that he dealt with, they tried to keep the law in many cases, and they felt that they were in. They were proud of it, but they had a superficial understanding of God's law. And Jesus so sums it up, and he says, love the Lord your God with all your hearts, with all your souls, with all your minds. Love your neighbor as yourself. And what Muslim can claim to do that? The rich young ruler loved his riches more than God. And so that's what Jesus nailed him on. Muslims need this fuller understanding of the law. You think you're loving God? Loving God is more than doing your prayers. What does it mean to love your spouse? Commit yourself daily to your partner. It doesn't only mean to do things for God. Also, the higher standard of the law has to do with your thoughts, with your motives, and even saying to someone he's a fool is really a very, very serious thing. You see, sin is the issue, isn't it? Sin is the issue. And we're trying to bring Muslims to an understanding of sin. What about Jesus' death? Is it necessary to have sacrifice for sin? The problem is it's not just that we're committing wrong deeds. The problem goes deeper than that. Our problem is not just that we need to be forgiven. Yes, God can forgive us. But what we really need is redemption. And that's why the sacrifice of Christ is so necessary. Now, Jesus chose to die. The atoning death, for another, I guess, is immoral, is it? No, because Jesus chose to die. It was a matter of love. We know that some people, we've heard about stories from World War II, and perhaps that they died for others. We have stories of this. Is this immoral for me, if I have no children, to die for one who has a wife and children? Well, this is God's own choice, God's own love. So we say to Muslims, who are we to tell God what is moral and not moral? God is what he wants to be. He is not required to give an account of what he is and what he does. Is it moral for God to forgive sin without punishing it? Is this moral? Yes, it is immoral. On reference to the cross, Kenneth Craig says, Muslims must agree. Number one, Jesus willed to endure it. Number two, Jesus willed to execute it. Number three, he willed to allow it. And then, again, we must point out to Muslims that the death of Jesus is ended in victory. He conquered death. And passing from one realm to another, he didn't just disappear. No, he said, today you will be with me in paradise. He conquered death, and death is very temporary for Jesus, and that's the way we must understand it.